Get my friend, well, I say friend because I was there in 1997, just about 22 years ago, when they founded the Convention of Business Integrity. And that's Soji Apampa, who was the co-founder and executive director at Convention for Business Integrity. He's also a co-founder and CEO of the Integrity Organization. He spent about 30 years of his life talking about integrity in business community. He's joining us live from our Abuja studios this morning for this very insightful conversation. Thank you, Soji. You know, yesterday you planned flying into Lagos for this conversation, and I think I warned you not to flying in this morning that this, how could I just be a prophet, by the way? You need to put something in my mouth. You plan to launch this morning and take a vehicle down to our studios, and I said, don't do it. Stay back in Abuja. Let's do this conversation via satellite. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. And this is, and you can just saw some images of what I went through this morning, like many others, hundreds and hundreds of Lagosians this morning going through this nasty thing.
Perhaps you jinxed it.
I need to add a second profession today, just being a journalist, maybe about soothsaying, something like that. I don't know if I'm going to make some money through that. Right now, I'm not making money. I'm just getting getting paid. But very big conversation today with you, and thank you very much for sending us what I call a sneak preview of this 61-page report that CBI, in partnership with others, put together, and that's the basis for this conversation. What are the key findings or that's contained in this survey report about Nigeria's seaports and terminal operations?
Basically, it's mixed news. We have some good news that at least most of the port users, they understand what the standard operating procedures are. And when I say most of the port users, I mean on the clearance side, and I mean those who are port users from Nigeria. So this is a survey of users in Nigeria. They seem to understand what the law says and what they're supposed to be doing in the ports. They also seem to understand where they can make complaints and lay their complaints if they're having challenges in getting either a vessel cleared or their cargo cleared. But one of the major findings has been that in this process, there's been too much discretion or room for discretion allowed to officials at the ports. And that this wide discretion is giving opportunity for a lot of corruption to also occur at the ports. We're finding that, yes, the work is going on well at the ports, but there are also challenges for users based on the infrastructure and the current state of infrastructure, which I think was what you were alluding to when you talked about the road and the congestion into the ports. Ports officials also talk about access to equipment, although the good news also from the report is that most port users feel there's adequate equipment for inspections when it's time for inspections. They feel they're still getting a reasonable level of service, for instance, from pilots, piloting vessels in, but most of the challenges have been around the use of wide discretionary powers by officials at the ports.
Great, setting the tone for this two-part conversation within the hour. Soji, so let's step back a little bit and take what they call a historical look at Nigeria seaports and terminals. Where do you think the problem really is here? When you look at the road we've traveled, this is a port, seaports, the main one in Lagos, both the roll-on, roll-off, the Roro and Tinkan Island and all of that, and a few other terminals. What's the problem here? Is it the structure of the seaports? Infrastructure, yes, I know, but is it a problem here with the structure?
I think the first thing is that when it was being designed, Nigeria's population was maybe less than 40 million. Today, we're talking about 200 million. And we haven't continued to review the infrastructure, both the access to the infrastructure in terms of access roads and the capacity of the equipment that we've got in there. It hasn't quite kept pace with the population growth, and linked to the population growth is the volume of transactions that are taking place at the ports. So as we've already mentioned, the infrastructure seems to have lagged behind the growth in the demand for the facilities at the ports. And that in itself is also linked to the fact that our growth in revenues as a country, growth in GDP, hasn't quite matched the demand and of industry, the demand of importers for infrastructure. We know what is happening in the power sector. We know what is happening with our roads generally. We know what is happening with public infrastructure generally, that we have not applied as much of our capital budgets as is needed for our growth to ensure that our facilities are keeping pace. So these are some of the reasons why we have ended up in this position. However, we've also spent a lot of money in the name of upgrading these facilities over the years, we're not quite sure that all of this money has ended up in achieving the specific reasons for which we've spent it. But that's the situation for another interview, I guess.
No. I think we need to bring everything into focus here today. So it's always very difficult to laying our hands on you. So let's have this conversation here. And I think this is very important to the current administration. So we started as a country, from independence that is, with so much in terms of agriculture. The groundnut pyramids in Kano and elsewhere in the north will have to move all the way to Lagos. So how did we get all those groundnuts in the north and the cocoa in the southwest and all of that and palm oil to the seaport? Number one. Number two, on the flip side, we started producing crude oil and importing petrol. So either ways, whether as an heavily import dependent or heavily export dependent, whichever way, we need the seaports. So how did we get to this point in terms of the reforms you're talking about? If we step back, perhaps not too far away into the Obasanjo's administration, with the port concessions, the terminal operators, which were done under his administration, and that presidential committee that was standing all the way through Obasanjo's period in power, and then the subsequent administrations to date.
Yeah, I think we need to go a little bit further back, because from colonial times, if you look at the whole architecture, it was an architecture of extraction. So all the rail lines were to extract from somewhere in the country and end up at the ports. The roads also led eventually emptying at the ports. And I think that if we had understood it properly, that it was an infrastructure for extraction, at least when we took over the running of the country, we should have had a very clear plan for how to keep growing it now for our own benefit, for the purposes of both export, and created new arteries for getting to the ports and resizing the ports for the kind of imports that we were bringing in. But you see, yes, we have had those presidential commissions, and we've had people look into the infrastructure at the ports, but the main difficulty has been around financing. We always seemed to have lagged behind what is required as a country for the financing. So if we have not allowed the private sector in early enough, and if we have not provided the kind of policies that will encourage investment by the private sector, we would not have also received the acceleration in investment that is required in order to keep pace with the development of trade and industry in a country as large as Nigeria. So I think it's still down to the way we finance infrastructure in Nigeria.
Great. So there is no ease of doing business yet, even with the executive order under the current administration, that there should be a port decongestion. Some steps had been taken a few days ago. We spoke to Dr. Jumake Oduwole here on the program, who is a special advisor to the president on ease of doing business, and quite a few things. And if you look at the latest World Bank ranking, Nigeria among the world top 20, the MPA, that's Nigerian Port Authority, in terms of e-payments and all of that, were part of the considerations of the World Bank in ranking Nigeria as one of the improvers of doing business worldwide in the latest 2020 report. So, do you think that we have made enough progress? What's this survey that your organization, in partnership with many others, a very great report there, I've read it a bit of it, some details over the last few days that you sent this to us here on channels. What does it really reveal about the ease of doing business yet within our seaport? In particular, who is in charge of the seaports in Nigeria?
Okay. In terms of the ease of doing business, you know, the first comment I would make is that the presidential order shows enormous political will in order to have this happen. So we have to give that to the administration. We also have to give it to the Enabling Business Environment Council, all the work and the reforms that they've been going through in order to get Nigeria improving in the World Bank rankings. However, when you have structural problems, such as roads that are not adequate to serve the ports or to take cargoes out of the ports, then even if you did make a presidential declaration, with those sorts of constraints, it can only go so far. So even if everybody wanted to comply, there are still some huge structural challenges that have to be overcome. And I think this is the kind of thing that we're seeing. So we would like to encourage the government to take some more steps. We know already that there is the plan to take cargoes to Ikorodu and other places in order to make it easier to decongest the ports at the moment. And I know that a lot of that requires working round the clock and even at weekends as well. But I'm not sure this is where all the players are together in the vision and the ambition to get this kind of change rolling through. But in terms of who is responsible, one of the things that we have come to observe is that in the ports, there are some turf wars going on, which is not unlike what we see in other sectors of governance and other sectors of service delivery because of overlapping mandates, similar mandates, and so on. So you find the agencies compete with one another from time to time. However, having said that, the Ports Authority appears to be the technical lead when it comes to running the ports and ensuring that there is effective and efficient service delivery. But on the side of the general operations, customer service, ensuring fair value, good value for money, and so on, the economic operator would appear to be the Shippers Council. So sometimes this brings a bit of friction, but I know that both agencies have been trying very hard to work with each other very closely, despite the challenges that they both have.
Then you have the big brother, the seaports, and that is the Nigeria Customs Service.
Yes, you see, in terms of even defining the standard operating procedures, there's been a project on since 2012 where all of the agencies at the ports, all of them, customs, immigrations, NDLEA, port health, even ICPC, the Ports Authority, Shippers Council, they've been working very closely together since 2012 when they conducted a risk assessment, a corruption risk assessment. They've been working together to define standard operating procedures to ensure that things are handled in a timely manner and that things are moving forward. This is probably the least well understood reform that the government has been pursuing, and it has bridged regime change several times. It's been going on since 2012, and it has been fully supported by the leadership of all of those agencies. So even the grievance mechanism, although users of the ports believe that they know where to report, they don't know the grievance mechanism that was set up by this port service support portal, which the agencies as a group have come up with, which can help users to resolve issues as quickly as 24 hours, 48 hours, with great success, ensuring that all of the issues are escalated to the top of the organization.
Just a quick one here.
Yes.
Let's take a break. We'll continue this conversation after the break. A very important part you're touching. I'm going to ask you quick questions about our SWOT analysis of Nigerian seaports and how we have allowed our neighbors in the West Coast to take advantage of our lackluster behavior over the last years to bring us to where we are today. Stand by, everyone. We'll be right back in about 2 minutes. Soji Apampa, the co-founder and executive director at the Convention on Business Integrity, and of course, a member, co-founder of the Integrity Organization. Thank you, Soji Apampa, for sticking with us. Let's continue that conversation from where you were about discretionary powers and what have you, who really is in charge of the seaport. But very important, we're playing a losing game here when you look at West Africa up to the point now that we have to shut our borders, partial closure of our borders, at least the southwestern part of the country, to smuggling and all of that from our friends and neighbors in West Africa. Again, if you look at piracy and all of that, why do folks have to land their rice, the chicken, turkey, and a few other things in Benin Republic seaports, which they've upgraded over time, and then bring them to Nigeria by road when the seaport is just here in Lagos to be used?
Well, number one, certain things have been prohibited from imports. So if you were to land them directly in Lagos or elsewhere, any other port in Nigeria, it's very likely they'll be confiscated. However, there are very big political actors in this country who have traditionally helped to facilitate a lot of the smuggling. Not my words. If you do your research, you'll find that this is a well-documented thing, that there are many people who are connected even to some of the, in high places, to some of the more prominent political parties, and have been aiding and abetting smuggling from textiles to foodstuff and so on. So when you have that kind of political scenario, including the very ridiculous statement made by some that there are people so powerful that you cannot become Comptroller General of Customs, at least before the current one, that was the history. You couldn't without their express knowledge and permission in order to do so. But we acknowledge that that is not currently the case with the current occupants of that office. But with those kinds of networks ruling and holding down the concessions at the ports, controlling the ports, and what happens through our borders, then it's not a surprise that Nigeria's loss will then become Benin Republic's gain, or much further up, Togo's gain, or even Ghana's gain. Because Nigeria is a signatory to certain instruments that give us common tariffs We're supposed to be able to move goods freely in and out of our borders. Some suggest that that is why it's so easy to import these contrabands into the neighboring countries and then find ways to get them across the border. We also hear stories that even under the current port closure, there are persons or entities who have paid for several hours for the borders to be left open for them to move things across very freely. I mean, all of these are insinuations and conjecture. However, when you look around and you see that the contraband items continue to be to proliferate the markets, then you would think that perhaps there is some credibility to these kinds of stories, that there are strong, powerful interests who manage access through the borders and the ports beyond the officials themselves.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes to wrap up this conversation, Soji. We still have a lot more. Trying to dissect your 61-page report is quite a Herculean task. But let's go back to what you call this white discretionary powers, and how does it feed into issues around professionalism, ethical conduct, and corrupt practices within the seaports and the terminals, between agencies, importers, and everyone else in between?
Okay, so the usual thing, whether it's in vessel clearance or cargo clearance, very often you have officials telling the parties that there is a contravention. Now, once they say there's a contravention, the next thing is there's a fine. How do you arrive at that fine? Most people don't know. How did they decide that they are right and it is the vessel owner or it is the owner of the cargo that is wrong? Again, that is very difficult to do, because usually you will find you have to go all the way up to Abuja to complain, and in the meantime, you run the risk of running extra costs that most shippers are not prepared to bear, and therefore they have to pay and allow it to go. So whether it's arguments over HS codes or arguments over whether there is a contravention or not, or whether a certain fine is applicable or not, these are the areas that are exploited. So let's take the oil and gas sector, for instance. An official boards the platform and says, well, you have more expatriates on board than we expected or that we believe we've got record for. We're going to shut down this rig. A shutdown is going to cost at least $1 million. So again, this is an opportunity for the officials to just wait it out and have the operators of the platform scrambling to make a payment. Another example, you have a part that is damaged on a rig, and a shutdown could cost you $1 million. So you have somebody hand carry, usually from somewhere in the US, hand carry the important part by first class and come to Nigeria the very next day with it. And they're going to just drop it at the airport and turn back with the aircraft. And then you find, reportedly, customs officials now setting a